The espresso machine's violent hiss cut through the morning air like a jet engine at full throttle, steam rising in ghostly spirals that Chen watched with the kind of focus she once reserved for instrument panels at 30,000 feet. Her calloused fingers worked the portafilter with mechanical precision, muscle memory from a different life, translating into the ritual of pulling shots. The patch on her worn leather jacket, a faded Top Gun insignia with Viper Squadron embroidered beneath, caught the fluorescent light as she moved behind the counter of Groundwork Coffee, a name that carried more irony than any of her customers could possibly know. The morning rush was in full swing, Seattle's tech workers and university students flowing through the cramped coffee shop like a river of caffeine dependency in laptop bags. Maya had memorized their orders within the first week. The anxious graduate student who always ordered a triple-shot Americano with oat milk, his hand shaking from more than just the cold. The software engineer who insisted on exactly 2 pumps of vanilla syrup, no more, no less, as if precision could somehow control the chaos of her failing startup. The retired professor who came in every Tuesday for a simple black coffee and stayed for 3 hours, reading Hemingway novels with the dedication of someone trying to solve life's greatest mysteries. But this morning felt different. Maya had woken before dawn with that familiar tightness in her chest, the phantom sensation of G-forces pressing against her ribs, even though her feet had been planted firmly on the ground for 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days. She'd counted. Every morning when she laced up her sneakers instead of flight boots, every evening when she locked the shot instead of walking across a carrier deck under an endless canopy of stars. "Large coffee, black, and make it strong enough to wake the dead," came a voice from the growing line, cutting through her reverie. Maya looked up to see a man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, cropped military short, wearing a navy peacoat that had seen better decades. Something in his posture, spine straight, shoulders back, eyes that swept the room in calculated patterns, triggered recognition circuits in Maya's brain that had been dormant for years. Behind her stood a younger woman, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of nervous energy Maya recognized in herself during the early days of flight training. The woman kept checking her phone, her free hand unconsciously adjusting an aviator watch that looked expensive and well-maintained. Her jacket was new leather, still stiff, with patches that gleamed under the coffee shop's harsh lighting. "Coming right up," Maya replied, reaching for the largest cup they had. As she poured, the rich aroma mixing with the mechanical sounds of the espresso machine and the low murmur of conversation, she caught fragments of their discussion. "The review board meets next week," the older man was saying, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected lives. "After what happened over the Pacific, they're looking for any excuse to ground experienced pilots. The media's calling it pilot error, but we both know what really happened up there." The younger woman's jaw tightened. 16 years of perfect service record and they want to throw it all away because some contractor cut corners on maintenance schedules. "The hydraulics failed, Tom. The hydraulics failed and somehow that's my fault for not performing miracles." Maya's hand stilled on the coffee pot. The conversation triggered a cascade of memories she'd spent 3 years trying to bury. The smell of jet fuel mixing with salt air, the weight of a helmet against her skull, the absolute silence that fell over a carrier deck when something went wrong during a landing. She'd lived in that world once, where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home and becoming a memorial plaque in some forgotten hallway. "Here's your coffee," Maya said, sliding the cup across the counter. As the man reached for it, his eyes caught her patch. For a moment, recognition flickered across his features, not of her specifically, but of something familiar, something that belonged to his world. "Viper Squadron," he said, his tone shifting from casual customer to something more measured. "That's an interesting patch. Vintage Top Gun?" Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks, a mixture of pride and pain that came with being seen for who she used to be, rather than who she'd been forced to become. "Just a fan of the movie," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth.
It was easier than explaining, easier than watching someone's expression change from respect to pity when they learned that Lieutenant Commander Maya Phoenix Chen, former Navy pilot with over 3,000 flight hours and 2 commendations for valor, now spent her days asking if people wanted their coffee for here or to go. But the man wasn't buying it. His eyes moved from the patch to her hands, hands that bore the telltale calluses of someone who'd spent years gripping control sticks and manipulating instrument panels, then to her posture, the way she held herself with unconscious military bearing even while wearing an apron over jeans and a flannel shirt. "Tom Mitchell," he said, extending his hand across the counter. "Captain, retired. Flew F-18s out of Lemoore for 15 years before they stuck me behind a desk at the Pentagon." He gestured to the woman beside him. "This is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh, currently fighting the good fight to keep her wings." The coffee shop's ambient noise seemed to fade as Maya stared at the outstretched hand. 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity crumbled in an instant. She could lie again, could pretend she didn't understand the significance of his introduction, could retreat back into the safe cocoon of civilian invisibility she'd wrapped around herself like armor. Instead, she reached across the counter and shook his hand with the firm grip she'd been taught at Annapolis, the one that said you could trust her with your life at 40,000 feet in weather that would ground commercial aircraft. "Maya Chen," she said quietly. "Lieutenant Commander, formerly. Phoenix was my call sign." The recognition hit Tom's eyes like lightning. "Phoenix! Jesus Christ! Phoenix Chen! You're the pilot who saved that entire carrier group during the typhoon off Guam. They wrote papers about that landing. Instructors at Top Gun still show the footage." Behind him, Sarah Walsh's phone had stopped buzzing, her attention completely captured by the conversation unfolding across the coffee counter. Other customers were beginning to notice the delay, shifting impatiently in line. But Maya found herself frozen in a moment that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that once you stepped forward, there was no going back. "That was a long time ago," Maya managed, though her voice carried none of the dismissive tone she'd been practicing for 3 years. "Different life." "What happened?" Tom asked, and Maya could hear in those 2 words all the questions that came with discovering a legend washing dishes and steaming milk in a Seattle coffee shop. It was a question that deserved an answer, but answering meant opening doors she'd spent every day since her medical discharge trying to keep locked. The espresso machine chose that moment to release another burst of steam, the sound sharp and urgent like an aircraft warning system. Maya turned toward it gratefully, buying herself a few seconds to steady her breathing and decide how much truth she was willing to share with strangers, even strangers who understood the weight of wings on your chest and the way the sky could call to you like a siren song. When she turned back, Tom and Sarah were still waiting, their eyes holding the kind of patience that came from military training. They understood that some stories couldn't be rushed, that the important truths took time to emerge. "Vestibular disorder," Maya said, the medical terminology rolling off her tongue like a foreign language she'd been forced to learn. "Inner ear damage from a hard landing during a training exercise. The doctor said it was probably cumulative. Too many carrier landings, too many high-G maneuvers, too many years of pushing the human body beyond what it was designed to handle." She paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "One day I could thread an F-18 through a thunderstorm without breaking a sweat. Next, I couldn't pass a basic balance test without falling over." The silence that followed carried the weight of understanding. Every military pilot lived with the knowledge that their career could end not with the glory of combat or the satisfaction of a hot air on a shoulder patch, but with the result of a doctor's visit that could wreck your dreams and take your identity. Successful mission, but with a medical form marked unfit for duty, and a civilian life they'd never prepared for. "How long?" Sarah asked, her voice soft with the kind of empathy that could only come from someone who understood how quickly everything could change. 3 years, 2 months, 17 days, Maya answered automatically, then caught herself. Not that I'm counting. Tom's laugh was bitter, but not unkind. We all count. It's what we do when we lose the thing that defined us. He took a sip of his coffee, grimacing slightly at the strength. Perfect coffee, by the way, strong enough to fuel a night carrier landing. Behind them, the line of customers had grown longer, and Maya could see her coworker Jessica emerging from the back room with a questioning look. The lunch rush was about to begin, and Seattle coffee culture waited for no one, not even former Navy pilots having reunions across espresso machines. But as Maya moved to serve the next customer, Tom placed his hand briefly on the counter. "We're not done with this conversation," he said quietly. "Sarah's hearing is next week. The review board could use someone with your experience to testify about the kind of split-second decisions pilots have to make when equipment fails." He pulled out a business card, sliding it across the counter. "Think about it. Sometimes the best way to help other people fly is to tell the truth about why you can't." Maya picked up the card, its crisp edges sharp against her fingers. Captain Thomas Mitchell, aviation safety consultant, it read, with a phone number and an address in D.C. that was probably walking distance from the Pentagon. As Tom and Sarah moved toward a corner table, their conversation shifting back to legal strategies and character witnesses, Maya found herself staring at the card. For 3 years, she told herself that her flying days were over, that the skills and knowledge she'd accumulated over a lifetime of aviation were as useless as yesterday's weather report. She'd convinced herself that serving coffee was a noble enough way to spend the decades stretching ahead of her, that anonymity was preferable to the questions and the pity and the constant reminder of what she'd lost. But holding Tom's card in her hand, watching Sarah Walsh prepare for a fight that could determine whether she'd ever fly again, Maya felt something stirring in her chest that she'd thought was dead forever. It wasn't the old hunger for flight. That particular ache would probably never fully heal. It was something different, something that had more to do with purpose than altitude. The next customer stepped forward, a familiar face, the anxious graduate student with his triple-shot Americano, and Maya slipped the card into her apron pocket as she reached for his usual cup. But as she worked through the familiar motions of grinding, tamping, and pulling shots, her mind was 30,000 feet in the air, remembering what it felt like to be trusted with something that mattered more than perfect foam art and customer satisfaction ratings. "Triple Americano with oat milk," she called out, sliding the cup across the counter. The graduate student nodded his thanks, already buried in his laptop screen, oblivious to the fact that the woman who'd just made his coffee had once landed a crippled fighter jet in weather that would have challenged commercial pilots on their best day. As the morning rush continued around her, Maya found herself counting something other than the days since her medical discharge. She was counting the pilots she'd known who'd faced review boards, the careers that had ended not with mechanical failures or enemy fire, but with paperwork and bureaucratic decisions made by people who'd never felt the weight of responsibility that came with being trusted to fly. Maybe Tom Mitchell was right. Maybe the best way to help other people fly is to tell the truth about why you couldn't. And maybe, after 3 years of serving coffee and pretending her past didn't matter, it was time to remember that some fights were worth having even if you couldn't pilot the aircraft yourself. The espresso machine hissed again, steam rising like contrails in a clear sky, and Maya Chen began to imagine what it might feel like to be useful again.
Maya's apartment occupied the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house in Capitol Hill, its windows facing east toward the mountains she could never quite see through Seattle's perpetual haze. The space reflected 3 years of careful civilian construction, IKEA furniture arranged with military precision, walls painted in neutral colors that suggested no particular personality or history, and exactly one photograph displayed, a sunset over the Pacific taken from the deck of a carrier, carefully cropped to exclude any identifying details. Every morning at 0500, her body woke without an alarm clock, muscle memory from decades of military scheduling overriding her civilian need for extra sleep.
She'd lie in bed for exactly 5 minutes, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood waking up, garbage trucks grinding through narrow streets, early commuters starting their cars, the distant hum of Interstate 5 carrying people to places they were qualified to go. Then she'd rise, make her bed with corners tight enough to bounce a quarter, and begin the routine that had replaced flight preparation. Shower, coffee strong enough to strip paint, 10 minutes of stretching exercises designed by a physical therapist to address the lingering effects of inner ear damage. The exercises were a daily reminder of limitations, simple movements that had once been automatic, standing on one foot, walking in a straight line with eyes closed, tracking objects with her head tilted, now required conscious effort and careful attention. The vestibular damage had stolen more than her ability to fly. It had taken the unconscious confidence of someone who'd always trusted her body to perform under any conditions. Now she moved through the world with the careful attention of someone who knew that balance was provisional, that the ground beneath her feet could shift without warning. But it was the dreams that revealed the depth of what she'd lost, not nightmares, those she could have handled, processed, worked through with the kind of military efficiency she'd applied to every other challenge in her life. Instead, they were perfect reconstructions of perfect flights, dawn patrols over blue water that stretched to the horizon, formation flying where the margin for error was measured in inches, and night landings where the carrier deck appeared like a postage stamp of light in an ocean of darkness. She'd wake from these dreams with tears on her cheeks and the phantom sensation of a control stick in her hands, the muscle memory of flight so vivid she could feel the aircraft responding to inputs she'd never make again. Work at Groundwork Coffee provided structure, if not purpose. Maya had chosen the job deliberately, not for passion or career advancement, but because it required skills that bore no resemblance to aviation. The learning curve had been brutal, in ways she'd never expected. Military training had taught her to master complex systems under extreme pressure, but it had never prepared her to remember that Mrs. Patterson wanted her latte extra hot, that the Tuesday regulars preferred their coffee beans ground fresh, even if it meant waiting an extra minute, or that customer service sometimes meant smiling and apologizing for problems that weren't your fault and couldn't be fixed with technical expertise. Her coworker Jessica, 23 years old and perpetually enthusiastic about coffee as a cultural movement, had appointed herself Maya's mentor in civilian social interactions. "You've got to stop standing at attention when customers complain," Jessica had said during Maya's second week. "It's intimidating. They want to feel heard, not like they're about to get court-martialed for ordering decaf." The observation had stung because it was accurate. Maya had spent her entire adult life in environments where clear communication and immediate action were virtues, where problems were solved rather than discussed, where hierarchy and protocol provided frameworks for decision-making. The ambiguity of civilian interactions, the unspoken rules, the emotional labor, the way conflict was often addressed through passive-aggressive hints rather than direct confrontation, felt like trying to navigate without instruments in weather too thick to see through. But she'd learned, gradually and sometimes painfully, to modulate her responses, to nod sympathetically when the startup founder complained about his investors, even though his problems seemed trivial compared to keeping aircraft operational on a carrier deck, to remember that the anxious graduate student's dissertation stress was real and valid, even if it didn't rise to the level of responsibility she'd carried when other people's lives depended on her technical competence. To find satisfaction in small gestures of competence, perfect foam art on a cappuccino, remembering a regular customer's modification, keeping the espresso machine calibrated to specifications that would have made her Navy maintenance chief proud. The work was honest, if limited, but honest work didn't fill the spaces that aviation had occupied in her identity. Maya found herself gravitating toward activities that provided echoes of her former life. She read Aviation Week religiously, following developments in military aircraft technology with the devotion of someone studying a language she could no longer speak fluently. She volunteered at the Museum of Flight on weekends, leading tours through exhibits that featured aircraft she'd flown or worked alongside, carefully identifying herself as someone with aviation background, rather than revealing the specifics of her experience. The museum work brought her into contact with other veterans transitioning to civilian life,
and their conversations often carried the undercurrent of shared displacement. There was Rodriguez, a former Air Force crew chief, who now worked in IT support and spent his free time restoring vintage aircraft engines with the kind of precision he'd once applied to keeping fighters operational. There was Thompson, an Army helicopter pilot who'd become a commercial flight instructor after losing his left leg to an IED, teaching civilian pilots skills he'd learned dodging surface-to-air missiles in Afghanistan. They didn't talk directly about the transition. Military culture had taught them all to handle problems internally, to project competence even when struggling. But their conversations carried weight. The way Rodriguez would run his hands over engine components as if reading Braille. The way Thompson would unconsciously scan the sky during outdoor conversations, tracking aircraft with the automatic attention of someone who'd learned that situational awareness was survival. The way Maya herself would feel her heart rate increase whenever she heard jet engines overhead, her body responding to sounds that had once meant she was going to work. It was during one of these weekend museum shifts that Maya had first encountered the deeper complexity of her situation. A group of high school students, part of a STEM program designed to interest young people in aviation careers, had been touring the military aircraft exhibit. Their questions were sharp and enthusiastic. How fast did the fighters fly? What did it feel like to land on a carrier? How did someone become a Navy pilot? Maya had answered factually, drawing on her knowledge without revealing its source, until one of the students, a young woman with the kind of focused intelligence Maya recognized in herself at that age, had asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. Why didn't you become a pilot yourself? You know so much about it. The lie had come automatically. I wasn't qualified for military service. But even as she spoke, Maya had seen something shift in the student's expression, a dimming of possibility that felt like watching someone's dreams reduce in real time. The girl had nodded politely and moved on to examine a display about aircraft maintenance, but Maya had carried the weight of that moment for weeks afterward. How many young people were making decisions about their futures based on limitations they'd assumed were universal? How many opportunities were lost because the people with actual experience were too proud or too broken to share what they'd learned? The question followed her home to her carefully neutral apartment, where she'd sit at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and stare at the single photograph on her wall. The sunset was beautiful, she'd always thought. Golden light on blue water, the kind of natural spectacle that made the dangers and difficulties of carrier operations seem worthwhile. But cropped out of the frame was everything that had made the moment meaningful. The aircraft arranged with geometric precision on the flight deck, the crew members who'd worked 18-hour days to keep the mission running, the complex ballet of logistics and human effort that had made it possible for someone to be in position to witness that particular sunset from that particular perspective. She'd begun to wonder if her carefully constructed anonymity was another kind of amputation, if by hiding her experience she was cutting herself off from the possibility of being useful in ways that didn't require her to pass physical fitness tests or maintain flight readiness. The thought was both frightening and appealing. Frightening because it meant acknowledging that her flying days were truly over. Appealing because it suggested there might be other ways to matter. The business card from Captain Mitchell had been sitting on her kitchen table for 2 weeks, moved from pocket to purse to table, but never discarded. Maya found herself reading it during her morning coffee routine, turning the crisp white cardstock between her fingers as if it were a navigation chart for territory she'd never explored. Aviation Safety Consultant, the title read. What did that mean exactly? What kind of work did former pilots do when they couldn't fly anymore? She'd looked up Mitchell's background online, finding references to his post-retirement work in accident investigation and pilot advocacy. The articles painted a picture of someone who'd found purpose in translating military aviation experience into civilian safety improvements,
who testified before congressional committees and consulted on aircraft design modifications. Someone who'd learned to fight for aviation safety from the ground rather than the cockpit.
The more Maya read, the more she understood that her situation wasn't unique. Military aviation produced hundreds of highly trained professionals every year who, for various reasons, medical issues, family obligations, career changes, transitioned to civilian life while retaining knowledge that could benefit others. Some became commercial pilots or flight instructors. Others moved into aerospace engineering or aircraft manufacturing. A few, like Mitchell, found ways to advocate for safety and training improvements that could prevent the kinds of accidents that ended careers and lives. But many others, like Maya herself, simply disappeared into civilian anonymity, their experience and expertise lost to careers that bore no resemblance to aviation. It was a waste of human resources that would have been unthinkable in the military, where every qualified person was too valuable to lose. In civilian life, it was just another example of how people reinvented themselves when circumstances demanded change. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 3 years telling herself that her flying days were over, that she needed to accept civilian life and find satisfaction in work that didn't depend on technical competence or life-or-death decision-making. But the conversation with Mitchell and Walsh had reminded her that aviation was larger than any individual's ability to fly. It was a community of knowledge and experience, a continuous conversation about safety and improvement, and the careful balance between acceptable risk and human limitation. Maybe it was time to stop pretending she'd never been part of that conversation. Maybe it was time to remember that some expertise was too valuable to waste on perfect foam art and customer service smiles. Maya picked up Mitchell's card one more time, this time carrying it to her laptop. As she opened a new email and began to type, she felt something that had been absent from her life for 3 years, the sensation of moving towards something that mattered, rather than simply away from something she'd lost. The Pentagon building squatted against the Virginia skyline like a concrete fortress, its corridors echoing with the controlled urgency of a military machine that never quite stopped moving. Maya had forgotten the particular acoustics of government buildings, the way voices carried differently in spaces designed to contain classified conversations, the subtle hierarchy embedded in everything from door access to parking assignments. Walking through the entrance designated for civilian consultants, she felt like an anthropologist returning to study a culture she'd once inhabited but no longer quite understood. Captain Mitchell met her at the security checkpoint, his civilian suit a subtle reminder that they were both operating in the space between military and civilian worlds. "Phoenix," he said, using her call sign with the easy familiarity of someone who understood that certain identities transcended rank or current employment. "Thank you for coming. Sarah's hearing is tomorrow, and your testimony could make the difference between her keeping her wings and getting grounded permanently." They walked through corridors lined with photographs of military leaders and aircraft that Maya recognized from her active duty years. The images felt like archaeological artifacts from her former life. F-18s in formation flight, carrier operations in various weather conditions, pilots in flight suits standing beside aircraft they'd trusted with their lives. She found herself unconsciously straightening her posture, muscle memory translating civilian clothes back into military bearing. "What exactly happened out there?" Maya asked, as they walked. "Sarah mentioned hydraulic failure, but the media reports are talking about pilot error." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "That's the problem. The official accident report is classifying it as pilot error resulting in controlled flight into terrain, but the real story is more complicated." He stopped at a door marked Conference Room C and turned to face her. "The hydraulic system failed during a training exercise over the Pacific. Sarah had about 30 seconds to decide whether to try for a dead-stick landing on a carrier deck or punch out over open water. She chose to try to save the aircraft. Maya felt a chill of recognition. Every carrier pilot lived with scenarios like this, training for the moment when mechanical systems failed and human judgment became the only thing standing between a successful recovery and catastrophic loss. The calculations were brutal and instantaneous. Aircraft replacement costs, pilot recovery probability, weather conditions, fuel.
Remaining, proximity to alternative landing sites. In 30 seconds, Sarah Walsh had been forced to weigh variables that accident investigators would spend months analyzing. She made it back? Maya asked. Though she already knew the answer, Sarah was alive and facing a hearing rather than a memorial service. Barely. Came in hard and fast, caught the 3 wires with maybe 10 seconds of fuel remaining. Perfect textbook emergency landing, except the review board is claiming she should have ejected rather than risk a deck landing with compromised controls. Mitchell opened the conference room door. They're using the incident to justify new safety protocols that would essentially ground any pilot who faces a similar situation. Inside the conference room, Maya found herself face-to-face with the kind of institutional machinery she'd hoped to leave behind. 3 officers in dress uniforms sat behind a polished table, their ribbons and rank insignia creating a visual hierarchy that needed no explanation. To their right, a court reporter waited beside a recording device that would capture every word for official transcripts. To their left, a civilian attorney in an expensive suit shuffled through documents with the careful attention of someone billing by the hour. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh sat alone at a smaller table facing the board, her dress blues immaculate but unable to hide the tension in her shoulders. She looked up as Maya and Mitchell entered, gratitude and desperation warring in her expression. This was someone fighting for her professional life, Maya realized, facing the kind of bureaucratic machinery that could end a career with a signature and a stamp. The board will hear testimony regarding the incident of March 15th, announced the senior officer, a captain whose ribbon suggested combat experience in multiple theaters. The witness will state her name and qualifications for the record. Maya took the witness chair feeling like she was stepping back into uniform after 3 years of civilian clothes. Lieutenant Commander Maya Chen, retired, call sign Phoenix. 15 years active duty, Navy flight training at Pensacola and Top Gun Advanced Fighter Tactics. 3,200 flight hours in F-18s, including carrier operations in the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters. The questioning began with routine inquiries about her background and experience, the kind of credential establishing that Maya remembered from countless briefings and debriefings. But as the board moved into specifics about emergency procedures and decision-making under pressure, she found herself transported back to moments when she'd faced similar choices with similar time constraints and similar consequences for error. In your experience, Lieutenant Commander Chen, asked the civilian attorney, what factors would influence a pilot's decision to attempt a carrier landing with compromised aircraft rather than ejecting over open water? Maya took a breath, organizing her thoughts around principles she'd learned through training and experience rather than textbook study. Aircraft carrier operations exist in an environment where acceptable risk is calculated differently than civilian aviation. Every pilot knows that ejecting over water, especially in adverse weather conditions, carries significant survival risk. Water temperature, sea state, rescue proximity, pilot physical condition, all these factors influence the probability of successful recovery. She could see Sarah Walsh leaning forward slightly, recognizing the careful professional language that nonetheless captured the life-or-death reality of split-second decisions made at altitude and speed. Additionally, Maya continued, pilots are trained to consider the strategic value of aircraft preservation when safety margins allow. An F-18 represents millions of dollars in investment and months of operational availability. If a pilot believes there's a reasonable probability of successful recovery, attempting to save the aircraft is consistent with military training and expectations. The senior board member, Captain Harrison, according to his nameplate, leaned forward. But surely pilot safety takes precedence over equipment preservation. Absolutely, Maya replied, but pilots are also trained to make rapid risk assessments under pressure. If Lieutenant Commander Walsh believed her probability of survival was higher attempting a controlled landing than ejecting over open water,
Her decision was consistent with standard emergency training.
This was the heart of it, Maya realized. The gap between institutional policy, written by committees, and operational reality, experienced by individual pilots. The board was applying standards developed in conference rooms to decisions made in cockpits, using months of analysis to second-guess choices that had to be made in seconds. The questioning continued for 2 hours, ranging across technical details about hydraulic system failures, emergency landing procedures, and the psychological factors that influenced decision-making under extreme stress. Maya found herself drawing on experiences she'd buried for 3 years, remembering moments when she'd faced similar mechanical failures and time pressures. Each question felt like excavating artifacts from her former life, pulling up memories that were both painful and precise. During a brief recess, Sarah Walsh approached her with a kind of gratitude that was difficult to express in professional settings. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure anyone would understand what it was like up there. The review board makes it sound like I had hours to think it through instead of 30 seconds to make a choice between bad options and worse options." Maya nodded, remembering her own encounters with institutional machinery that reduced complex human decisions to checkbox evaluations. "They're trying to create policies that prevent future accidents," she said. "But sometimes policies written on the ground don't account for realities in the air." When the hearing resumed, the board's questioning took a different direction. Captain Harrison opened a folder that Maya recognized as her own service record. Somehow, they'd obtained documents she'd assumed were buried in military archives along with her active duty identity. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, your record shows an incident 3 years ago involving emergency landing procedures. Can you describe the circumstances that led to your medical retirement?" The question hit like turbulence, unexpected and disorienting. Maya had come here to testify about Sarah Walsh's situation, not to relive the circumstances of her own departure from military service. But she could see the strategic logic. If the board could establish that her own career had ended due to questionable judgment under pressure, her testimony about acceptable risk might carry less weight. "I was conducting a training exercise in adverse weather conditions," she said, choosing her words carefully. "High winds, poor visibility, carrier deck operations at the edge of safe parameters. During the final approach, I experienced severe spatial disorientation and executed a go-around rather than attempting a potentially dangerous landing." It was the clinical version of events, stripped of the terror and confusion that had marked the end of her flying career. She didn't mention the way the horizon had dissolved into gray nothingness, the sensation of the aircraft moving in directions that contradicted her instrument readings, the split second when she had realized that her inner ear was providing information that didn't match reality. She didn't describe the humiliation of the medical evaluation that followed, the battery of tests that revealed damage accumulated over years of high-G flight operations. "The medical evaluation found vestibular damage that made you unfit for flight duty," Captain Harrison continued. "Would you characterize this as a case where you should have pushed through the disorientation and attempted the landing?" Maya understood the trap being constructed. If she said yes, she was admitting to poor judgment that ended her own career. If she said no, she was arguing for the kind of conservative decision-making that might support grounding Sarah Walsh for choosing not to eject. "The situations are not comparable. My medical condition developed over time and affected my ability to process sensory information accurately. Lieutenant Commander Walsh was dealing with a mechanical failure that had immediate, time-limited solutions. I had the option to go around and try again. She did not." The distinction was crucial, she realized. The difference between chronic impairment that affected decision-making capability and acute mechanical failure that required immediate response. Her own career ended because her body could no longer be trusted to interpret flight conditions accurately. Sarah's career was in jeopardy because she'd been forced to choose between risky options under time pressure. The hearing continued through the afternoon, covering technical details about aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and risk management protocols. Maya found herself fielding questions that required her to translate between the technical language of aviation and the legal frameworks the board was using to evaluate Sarah's actions. It was exhausting work that demanded precise language and careful distinction between different types of judgment and risk. As the day wore on, Maya began to understand that this hearing was about more than Sarah Walsh's individual case. The military was grappling with broader questions about acceptable risk in an era when aircraft were increasingly expensive and pilots increasingly difficult to replace. Each incident became a case study in institutional learning, an opportunity to refine policies and procedures that balanced operational requirements against safety considerations. But institutional learning, Maya realized, could also become institutional paralysis. If every emergency decision was subject to months of committee analysis, if every pilot faced career-ending review for choices made under extreme pressure, the end result might be pilots so concerned with bureaucratic consequences that they failed to act decisively when action was required. During final questioning, the board's civilian attorney raised the issue that Maya had been dreading: whether her own medical retirement affected her credibility as an expert witness. "Ms. Chen," the attorney said, deliberately using her civilian title, "isn't it true that your own military career ended because you made a decision that was later determined to be medically inadvisable?" Maya felt the weight of 3 years' worth of carefully constructed civilian identity pressing against the military bearing she'd recovered for this testimony. The question forced her to choose between protecting the anonymity that had allowed her to rebuild her life and defending principles that extended beyond her individual situation. "My career ended because I developed a medical condition that made me unfit for flight duty," she said. "But my experience with that condition taught me something important about the difference between physical limitations and judgment under pressure. When I experienced spatial disorientation, I recognized that my sensory inputs were unreliable and chose not to trust them. That's exactly the kind of judgment we train pilots to exercise." She paused, looking directly at Captain Harrison. Lieutenant Commander Walsh was dealing with mechanical failure, not medical impairment. Her instruments were providing accurate information about a dangerous situation. Her training was intact. Her decision-making capability was uncompromised. She made a calculated risk assessment and executed it successfully. The fact that it was dangerous doesn't make it wrong. The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, charged with implications that would determine not just Sarah Walsh's career, but potentially the careers of other pilots facing similar decisions. Maya realized that her testimony was part of a larger conversation about institutional risk tolerance, about whether the military would continue to trust its pilots to make difficult decisions under pressure, or would instead create policies that removed individual judgment from emergency situations. As the hearing concluded and the board retired to deliberate, Maya found herself standing in the Pentagon corridor with Sarah Walsh and Captain Mitchell, all three of them veterans of military service trying to navigate the intersection between institutional requirements and individual conscience. "How long before they decide?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who'd learned to compartmentalize fear during flight operations, but couldn't quite manage it in bureaucratic settings. "Could be hours, could be days. Depends on whether they're just rubber stamping a predetermined decision or actually wrestling with the implications." He looked at Maya with something approaching admiration. "That was good testimony. You managed to defend Walsh's decision without directly challenging the board's authority to review it." Maya nodded, though she felt drained by the effort of translating her experience into language that could survive legal scrutiny. The hearing had forced her to articulate principles she'd internalized through years of training and practice, to make explicit the decision-making processes that had become automatic during her flying career. It was like being asked to explain breathing, essential, unconscious, and surprisingly difficult to break down into component parts.
They walked toward the visitor parking area, through corridors that felt increasingly foreign despite Maya's familiarity with military culture.
3 years of civilian life had created distance she hadn't fully appreciated until returning to this environment. The rhythms were the same, the careful formality, the emphasis on precision and protocol, the underlying current of serious purpose, but she no longer felt like she belonged here. "What happens if they ground her?" Maya asked as they reached the parking garage. "Desk job, probably," Mitchell said. "Maybe training instruction if she's lucky. Or they transfer her to a non-flying position and she spends the rest of her career pushing paperwork and watching other people do the job she trained for." He paused beside his car. "Same thing that happens to a lot of good pilots who make the wrong enemies or face the wrong review board at the wrong time." The casual brutality of that assessment struck Maya like a physical blow. She'd always known that military careers could end abruptly, but she'd assumed that competent pilots who followed procedures and maintained safety records would be protected by institutional logic. The idea that bureaucratic politics could ground someone like Sarah Walsh, clearly competent, obviously dedicated, revealed flaws in the system she'd served with such devotion. As they parted ways in the parking garage, Sarah Walsh approached Maya with the kind of directness that military training encouraged in important conversations. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need an honest answer." Maya waited, recognizing the tone of someone about to request truth that might be uncomfortable to hear or give. "Do you think I made the right choice up there?" Sarah asked, not for the review board, not for the record, but as one pilot to another. "Do you think I should have been ejected?" The question carried weight beyond its immediate implications. Sarah was asking Maya to evaluate not just technical decision-making, but the deeper question of whether the risks inherent in military aviation were worth taking when safer alternatives existed. It was a question that cut to the heart of what it meant to be a military pilot in an era when human life was valued more highly than equipment preservation. Maya thought about her own emergency landings, the split-second decisions that had somehow always worked out until the day they didn't. She thought about the pilots she'd known who'd ejected safely and the ones who'd pushed their luck and paid for it with career-ending injuries or worse. She thought about the institutional pressures that encouraged both aggressive risk-taking and conservative safety margins, often simultaneously. "You made the decision with the information you had in the time you had to make it," Maya said finally. "That's all any of us can do. The review board has months to analyze 30 seconds of your life, but you have to live those 30 seconds in real time, with real consequences." Sarah nodded, but Maya could see that the answer wasn't entirely satisfying. Like most military pilots, Sarah had been trained to believe that there were right decisions and wrong decisions, that competent analysis would always reveal the optimal choice. The ambiguity of emergency situations, where multiple choices might be defensible and outcomes depended as much on luck as judgment, was harder to accept than the clear-cut scenarios of training exercises. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "I keep running it through my head, thinking about all the ways it could have gone wrong. If I had been 2 degrees off on final approach, if the wind had shifted, if the deck crew had been a split-second slow with the arresting cables, any of those variables could have turned a successful recovery into a disaster." I understood the mental loop Sarah was trapped in, the endless replay of decisions that couldn't be changed and outcomes that couldn't be guaranteed. It was the pilot's version of survivor's guilt, the burden of knowing that success often depended on factors beyond individual control. "That's the job," Maya said. "We take calculated risks with imperfect information and live with the consequences. The alternative is staying on the ground, which eliminates the risk but also eliminates the mission." They stood in the parking garage for several more minutes, 2 former naval aviators discussing the philosophical underpinnings of a profession that demanded both technical precision and acceptance of fundamental uncertainty. It was a conversation Maya hadn't realized she'd been craving, the kind of professional dialogue that civilian life rarely provided,
where shared experience created understanding that didn't require extensive explanation. As Maya drove back toward Seattle, she found herself thinking not just about Sarah Walsh's hearing, but about the broader implications of institutional risk management in military aviation. The review board was wrestling with genuine concerns about pilot safety and equipment preservation, but their solutions might create new problems. If every emergency decision became subject to career-threatening review, pilots might become so risk-averse that they fail to act decisively when action was required. The drive through Virginia's rolling hills provided time to process the day's events and their connection to her own experience. For 3 years, Maya had told herself that her medical retirement was simply bad luck, a random medical condition that had ended her flying career through no fault of her own. But the hearing had forced her to confront more complex questions about institutional support for pilots facing career-ending situations. How many other pilots were struggling with medical issues, family pressures, or career transitions without adequate support systems? How many were choosing between personal well-being and professional identity, between accepting limitations and fighting institutional machinery designed to protect the service rather than the individual? How many were, like herself, simply disappearing into civilian anonymity rather than finding ways to contribute their experience and expertise? The questions followed her onto the plane back to Seattle, where she sat in a window seat watching the country pass beneath her at 35,000 feet. Commercial aviation felt strange after years of military flying, the passive experience of being transported rather than controlling the flight. The civilian passengers who took for granted the complex technical systems that kept them safely airborne. She found herself unconsciously monitoring the flight instruments visible from her seat, checking altitude and heading with the automatic attention of someone trained to maintain situational awareness. But it was also peaceful in a way she hadn't expected. For 3 years, the sound of jet engines had triggered a mixture of longing and loss that made air travel emotionally exhausting. Today, surrounded by the routine competence of commercial aviation, she felt something different, a recognition that flight was larger than any individual's ability to pilot aircraft, that the skills and knowledge she developed during her military career were part of a broader human enterprise that continued whether or not she personally could participate. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The plane began its descent into Seattle as the sun set over the Pacific, the city's lights creating patterns that reminded Maya of carrier deck illumination during night operations. From her window seat, she could see aircraft from Boeing Field and SeaTac Airport, creating an aerial ballet that required the same kind of coordination and precision she'd once been part of. Somewhere down there, air traffic controllers were managing traffic flows with the kind of systematic competence that military aviation had taught her to appreciate. Somewhere, maintenance crews were conducting the kind of detailed technical work that kept complex systems operational. She was still part of that world, Maya realized, even if she couldn't pilot aircraft herself. Her knowledge and experience remained valid, even if her medical condition prevented her from applying them directly. The question was whether she could find ways to contribute that didn't require her to pass flight physicals or maintain currency in aircraft she'd never fly again. The business card Captain Mitchell had given her was still in her wallet, but now it represented more than just an opportunity to help Sarah Walsh. It suggested the possibility of professional identity that wasn't entirely dependent on her ability to perform the specific tasks that had defined her military career. Aviation safety consulting, pilot advocacy, training development, roles that required expertise without demanding physical capability. As the plane touched down at SeaTac, Maya felt the familiar satisfaction of a successful landing executed by competent professionals using systems she understood. For the first time in 3 years, being a passenger rather than a pilot felt like a choice rather than a limitation.
She was still connected to aviation, still part of the community of knowledge and experience that made flight possible, even if her role had changed. The next morning, Maya woke at 0500 as usual, but instead of beginning her routine of exercises and coffee preparation, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and began researching aviation safety organizations, pilot advocacy groups, and consulting firms that specialized in translating military experience into civilian applications. The work felt like navigation planning, identifying destinations, calculating routes, assessing resources required for successful completion. By the time she needed to leave for her shift at Groundwork Coffee, Maya had compiled a list of organizations that might value her experience and expertise. Some focused on accident investigation and prevention. Others worked on training development and safety protocol improvement. Several specialized in supporting military pilots transitioning to civilian careers. All of them seemed to operate on the principle that aviation expertise was too valuable to waste, regardless of an individual's current flight status. At the coffee shop, Maya moved through her opening routine with the same precision she'd always applied, but her mind was elsewhere. As she calibrated the espresso machine and arranged pastries in the display case, she was thinking about the testimony she'd given the day before and its implications for pilots currently facing similar situations. How many Sarah Walshes were out there fighting bureaucratic battles that could determine whether they continued flying or were grounded by committee decisions? How many were struggling alone with limited institutional support and inadequate advocacy? The morning rush began as usual, Seattle's caffeine-dependent professionals flowing through the shop in patterns Maya had memorized over 3 years of civilian service. But today she found herself looking at the customers differently. The anxious graduate student was fighting his own version of institutional machinery, trying to complete a dissertation under the pressure of funding deadlines and academic politics. The software engineer was navigating startup culture that demanded technical competence under resource constraints that would have been familiar to any military logistics officer. The retired professor was managing the transition from professional identity to civilian life that every veteran understood. They were all, in their own ways, dealing with versions of the challenges that military service had taught Maya to recognize and address. The specifics were different, but the underlying dynamics, institutional pressure, individual accountability, the balance between risk and safety, were remarkably similar. When Captain Mitchell called during her lunch break, Maya wasn't surprised to hear that Sarah Walsh's hearing had concluded with a split decision. The review board had declined to ground her immediately, but had placed her on administrative leave pending additional evaluation and training. It was the kind of institutional compromise that satisfied no one, but allowed everyone to claim partial victory. "It's not ideal," Mitchell said, "but it's better than a career-ending decision. Sarah will have another chance to prove her competence, and the precedent isn't as restrictive as it could have been." He paused. "Your testimony made a difference. The board took seriously the distinction you drew between medical impairment and mechanical failure." Maya felt the satisfaction that was different from anything she'd experienced during her civilian career. Her coffee shop work was competent and useful, but it was also replaceable. Any reasonably intelligent person could learn to operate an espresso machine and remember customer preferences. The testimony she'd given the day before had drawn on knowledge and experience that was genuinely specialized, that couldn't be easily acquired or replaced. "I've been thinking about what you said," Maya told Mitchell, "about finding ways to help other pilots. I'd like to know more about aviation safety consulting." The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes and covered territory Maya hadn't explored since her medical retirement. Mitchell described a community of former military pilots who'd found ways to contribute their expertise without returning to active flying duty. Some worked with aircraft manufacturers on design improvements informed by operational experience. Others consulted with airlines on training programs that incorporated lessons learned from military aviation. A few specialized in accident investigation and prevention, applying analytical skills developed during military service to civilian safety improvements.
The work isn't flying, Mitchell warned, but it's aviation. And it's work that matters. Work that can prevent the kinds of accidents that end careers and lives. Maya understood the distinction. She would never again experience the pure satisfaction of a perfect carrier landing or the adrenaline rush of formation flying at high speed and low altitude. But she might find ways to help other pilots avoid the mistakes that led to accidents, to support pilots facing the kinds of institutional pressure she'd witnessed at Sarah Walsh's hearing, to translate military aviation experience into improvements that benefited the broader aviation community. It wasn't the career she'd planned when she first strapped into an F-18, but it was a career that could provide purpose and professional identity without requiring her to pretend that her medical condition didn't exist. It was a way forward that acknowledged limitation while building on expertise, that accepted change while maintaining continuity with her professional past. As her lunch break ended and she returned to the coffee shop's afternoon routine, Maya found herself looking forward to the end of her shift with anticipation rather than resignation. For 3 years, leaving work had meant returning to an apartment where she tried not to think about the career she'd lost. Today, it meant returning to research and planning for a career she might be able to build. The espresso machine's familiar hiss sounded different somehow, less like a reminder of limitation and more like background noise to thoughts about possibilities she hadn't considered since her medical retirement. As Maya steamed milk and pulled shots, she was also calculating what would be required to transition from coffee service to aviation consulting. Additional education, professional networking, certification requirements, the gradual process of rebuilding professional identity around capabilities rather than limitations. It would be harder than serving coffee, more demanding than remembering customer preferences and maintaining equipment, but it would also be work that connected her to the aviation community she'd never really left, work that drew on knowledge she'd spent a lifetime acquiring, work that mattered in ways that her civilian job never could. For the first time in 3 years, Maya Chen felt like she was flying towards something rather than simply away from what she'd lost. The call came 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning, interrupting Maya's opening routine at Groundwork Coffee. Captain Mitchell's voice carried an urgency that made her set down the bag of coffee beans she'd been preparing to grind and step away from the morning prep work that had become second nature. Sarah Walsh's case just became national news, he said without preamble. Someone leaked the hearing transcripts to Aviation Week, and now there are congressional representatives asking questions about military pilot retention and career-ending review boards. Your testimony is being quoted in articles about institutional pressure on military aviators. Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with unexpected exposure, the feeling of being pulled back into visibility she'd spent 3 years avoiding. What kind of articles? The good kind, mostly. Advocacy pieces about supporting military pilots facing medical or administrative challenges. Profile pieces about the expertise the military loses when pilots like you disappear into civilian life without any institutional support for transition. Mitchell paused. But also the kind that might bring attention you're not ready for. Reporters are asking about the identity of the expert witness who provided compelling testimony about emergency decision-making.
Maya looked around the coffee shop. At the espresso machine she'd learned to operate with the same precision she'd once applied to aircraft systems, at the regular customers who trusted her to provide consistency and competence without asking questions about her background, at Jessica, emerging from the back room with the kind of cheerful energy that had made civilian social interactions feel manageable rather than exhausting. "I need to think about it," Maya said, "and I need to talk to some people." The first person she called was Jessica, who deserved to know that her reliable coworker might soon become the subject of media attention that could disrupt the coffee shop's carefully maintained atmosphere of caffeine-focused calm. The conversation took place during the afternoon lull, with Maya explaining as much as she felt comfortable sharing about her military background and recent testimony. "You're telling me you used to fly fighter jets off aircraft carriers?" Jessica said, her usual enthusiasm amplified by genuine amazement. "And you've been here for 3 years making coffee and never mentioned it?" "It wasn't relevant to the job," Maya replied, though she realized how inadequate that explanation sounded. How did you explain 3 years of deliberate anonymity to someone who'd grown up in a culture where personal branding and social media presence were considered essential life skills? Jessica shook her head with the kind of disbelief that suggested she was reconsidering everything she thought she knew about her coworker. "Maya, that's not just relevant, that's incredible. Do you know how many people would kill for that kind of experience? Do you know how many stories you could tell?" The disconnect was jarring. To Jessica, Maya's military career represented adventure and accomplishment that should be celebrated and shared. To Maya, it represented a loss so profound that she'd built her entire civilian identity around avoiding reminders of what she could no longer do. The gap between those perspectives felt as wide as the distance between civilian and military cultures. "The thing is," Maya said carefully, "if this becomes public, it might bring attention to the shop. Reporters, maybe. People wanting to talk about military issues or aviation safety. I don't want that to affect your work environment." Jessica considered this with the seriousness of someone who'd learned to navigate Seattle's complicated relationship with anything that attracted media attention. The city prized both privacy and authenticity, but in contradictory ways that can make sudden exposure uncomfortable for everyone involved. "Would you want to leave? If you could do aviation work again, would you want to go back to that world?" The question cut to the heart of decisions Maya had been avoiding for 3 years. Serving coffee was honest work that provided structure and income, but it wasn't work that utilized her education, training, or experience. Aviation consulting would be more demanding and uncertain, but it would also connect her to a professional identity and expertise that civilian life had forced her to suppress. "I don't know," Maya admitted. "For 3 years, I've been telling myself that chapter of my life was closed, but the hearing, the testimony, talking to pilots who are still fighting to stay current, it reminded me that aviation is bigger than any individual's ability to fly. Maybe there are ways to contribute that I haven't considered." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the afternoon regulars, and Maya returned to the familiar routine of coffee preparation with her mind spinning through implications and possibilities. The work felt different now, less like a permanent replacement for her previous career, and more like a temporary refuge while she figured out what came next. That evening, Maya's apartment felt like a staging area for decisions she'd been postponing since her medical retirement. She spread her laptop, notebooks, and research materials across her kitchen table and began the kind of systematic analysis that military training had taught her. To apply to complex problems. What were her options? What were the requirements for each option? What were the likely outcomes and associated risks? Aviation safety consulting emerged as the most promising direction, but it would require credentialing, networking, and the kind of professional visibility she'd been avoiding. Military pilots transitioning to civilian careers faced challenges that were well documented, but poorly addressed: identity adjustment, skill translation, institutional support gaps, and the psychological impact of moving from high-responsibility positions to civilian work that might not fully utilize their capabilities. Maya began researching organizations that specialized in these transitions, finding a community she hadn't known existed. The Military Aviation Consulting Network connected former pilots with companies and agencies that needed expertise in aircraft operations, safety analysis, and training development. The Veterans Aviation Foundation provided resources for pilots facing medical retirement or career transitions. The Institute for Aviation Safety Research conducted studies that translated military experience into civilian safety improvements. All of these organizations operated on principles Maya recognized from her military service: the belief that expertise was too valuable to waste, that experience-based knowledge could prevent future accidents and save lives, that professional communities had obligations to support their members through difficult transitions. They represented a world where her background would be an asset rather than something to hide, where her medical condition would be seen as a factor to work around rather than a disqualification from meaningful contribution. As she read through job descriptions and consulting opportunities, Maya realized that her 3 years of civilian experience weren't wasted time. They were evidence of adaptability and competence outside military structures. Coffee shop work had taught her customer service skills that would be valuable in consulting relationships. Museum volunteer work had developed her ability to translate technical knowledge for civilian audiences. The forced anonymity had given her perspective on the gap between military and civilian cultures that could be useful in bridging those differences professionally. The next morning brought a call from a reporter at Aviation Week who had somehow obtained Maya's contact information. The conversation was professional but persistent, focused on her testimony at Sarah Walsh's hearing and its implications for military pilot retention policies. "We're working on a series about institutional pressures on military aviators," the reporter explained. "Your testimony highlighted important issues about decision-making under pressure and the way review boards evaluate emergency situations. Would you be willing to discuss your own experience with medical retirement and the transition to civilian life?" Maya found herself at another decision point, this one carrying implications that extended beyond her individual situation. Military pilots facing similar transitions deserved to have their stories told and their challenges addressed. Aviation safety would benefit from honest discussion about the pressures that influenced pilot decision-making. The public deserved to understand the institutional factors that affected military readiness and pilot retention. But personal exposure came with costs Maya wasn't sure she was ready to pay. Media attention would end the anonymity that had allowed her to rebuild her life without constant reminders of what she'd lost. Public discussion of her medical condition would make her a case study rather than a private individual managing personal challenges. Professional visibility would create expectations and opportunities, but also scrutiny and pressure. "I need to think about it," Maya told the reporter, using the same words she'd used with Captain Mitchell. "Can I call you back?" The next few days passed in a blur of research, phone calls, and careful consideration. Maya spoke with other former military pilots who'd made successful transitions to civilian aviation work. She consulted with career counselors who specialized in military to civilian transitions. She researched the legal and ethical implications of public testimony and media engagement. Most importantly, she spent time at the Museum of Flight, leading tours through exhibits that featured aircraft she'd flown, and talking with visitors about aviation history and technology. The work reminded her of why she'd chosen military aviation in the first place, not just for the thrill of flight, but for the opportunity to be part of something larger than herself, to contribute to missions that mattered, to use technical competence and training for purposes that extended beyond individual satisfaction. During one tour, a high school student asked the same question that had troubled Maya months earlier. "Why didn't you become a pilot yourself? You know so much about these aircraft." This time, Maya's answer was different. "I was a pilot," she said, watching the student's expression shift from polite interest to genuine engagement. "I flew F-18s for 15 years before a medical condition ended my flying career. But aviation is bigger than any individual's ability to pilot aircraft. These planes exist because of the work of thousands of people: engineers, mechanics, air traffic controllers, safety inspectors, trainers. Flying them was an honor, but it was never the only way to contribute to aviation." The student asked follow-up questions that revealed genuine interest in aviation careers, and Maya found herself providing detailed information about flight training, military service options, and the various professional paths that led to aviation expertise. It was the kind of conversation she'd been avoiding for 3 years, but it felt natural and valuable in ways that coffee shop interactions never had. After the tour, Maya walked in the museum's exhibits with new eyes. These aircraft represented not just technological achievement, but human expertise accumulated over decades of training, practice, and institutional learning. Every improvement in safety, every advancement in capability, every successful mission had been built on knowledge shared between generations of aviation professionals. She was part of that continuum, Maya realized, whether or not she could currently pass a flight physical. Her experience and knowledge were contributions to that larger enterprise, not just personal achievements that had ended with her medical retirement. The question wasn't whether she could return to her former role. That was medically impossible. The question was how she could best contribute to the ongoing mission of aviation safety and improvement. That evening, Maya called Captain Mitchell and the Aviation Week reporter. To Mitchell, she expressed interest in serious conversation about aviation safety consulting and the credential requirements for that career transition. To the reporter, she agreed to an interview focused on institutional support for military pilots facing medical retirement and career transitions. Both conversations felt like crossing a threshold she'd been approaching for 3 years without realizing it. For the first time since her medical retirement, Maya was moving toward professional challenges rather than away from professional disappointment. She was choosing visibility and engagement over anonymity and isolation. The article appeared 2 weeks later as part of Aviation Week's series on military pilot retention. Maya's story was presented as an example of institutional failures that wasted valuable expertise and left competent professionals without adequate support during career transitions. The interview quoted her testimony from Sarah Walsh's hearing and included her perspective on the gap between military aviation training and civilian career options. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Maya received calls from other former military pilots facing similar transitions, from aviation safety organizations interested in her expertise, from consulting firms that specialized in translating military experience into civilian applications. She heard from current military pilots who were grateful to see their challenges acknowledged publicly, from family members of pilots who had struggled with career transitions, from civilian aviation professionals who wanted to better understand military aviation culture. For the first time in 3 years, Maya's military background became a point of connection rather than something to hide. Customers who had been polite but distant became genuinely interested in her perspective on current events involving military aviation. The coffee shop transformed into a space where her expertise was recognized and valued. Jessica approached her during a quiet afternoon with news that the shop's owner wanted to meet with Maya about the positive attention the article had brought to their business. "Apparently, we're getting calls from people who want to support a business that employs
veterans," Jessica said. "The owner thinks there might be opportunities to do more community outreach, maybe host events that bring together veterans and civilians." Maya felt the irony of the situation. For 3 years, she'd been trying to escape her military identity and blend into civilian life. Now, that same identity was creating opportunities and connections she hadn't anticipated. The challenge wasn't hiding her background anymore. It was figuring out how to manage the transition from anonymity to visibility in ways that served her long-term goals rather than simply responding to immediate opportunities. The phone call from Sarah Walsh came on a Friday evening as Maya was closing the coffee shop. Sarah's voice carried excitement and gratitude that made the institutional stress of her hearing seem like ancient history. "I'm back on flight status," Sarah announced. "Full reinstatement, no restrictions, and they're assigning me to a training position where I'll be working with pilots facing similar situations." She paused. "The review board cited your testimony as one of the factors that influenced their final decision. They said your analysis helped them understand the difference between questionable judgment and reasonable decision-making under pressure." Maya felt a satisfaction that was deeper and more lasting than anything she'd experienced during her civilian career. Her testimony had helped a competent pilot maintain her career and continue contributing to military aviation. Her expertise had influenced institutional decision-making in ways that could benefit other pilots facing similar challenges. Her knowledge and experience had proven useful in ways that extended beyond her individual ability to fly aircraft. "What's next for you?" Sarah asked. "Mitchell told me you're considering aviation safety consulting." "I'm researching the transition. It would mean leaving coffee shop work and rebuilding a professional identity around consulting and advocacy rather than flying. Different challenges, different rewards." "But still aviation," Sarah said. still contributing to the mission, just from a different position. Maya looked around the coffee shop, at the espresso machine she'd mastered, at the regular customers who'd become part of her daily routine, at the simple competence of work that required no explanation or justification. For 3 years, this space had provided structure and purpose when her identity was too broken to support professional ambition. Now it felt like a launching pad rather than a destination, a place where she'd recovered stability and confidence that could support more demanding challenges. The transition to aviation consulting wouldn't erase the satisfaction she'd found in civilian work, but it would build on that foundation to create something more aligned with her expertise and training. "Yeah," Maya said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "Still aviation, still contributing to the mission." As she locked the coffee shop and walked to her car, Maya felt the weight of 3 years' worth of careful civilian construction shifting into something more dynamic and ambitious. For the first time in 3 years, 2 months, and 23 days, Maya Chen was ready to stop counting and start building. 6 months later, Maya stood in a conference room at Boeing Field, looking out at aircraft that represented the intersection of military and civilian aviation technology. The view was deliberate. Her new office with aviation safety solutions had been chosen specifically to provide daily reminders that the work happening inside these walls had direct connections to the aircraft and pilots who depended on their analysis and recommendations.
The transition from coffee shop employee to aviation safety consultant had been more complex than changing careers usually required. Maya had needed to obtain civilian certifications that translated her military experience into credentials that corporate clients would recognize and value. She'd completed courses in accident investigation methodology, safety management systems, and regulatory compliance that built on her operational experience but required new frameworks for analysis and reporting. More challenging had been learning to navigate the civilian aviation industry's culture, which shared some similarities with military aviation but operated under different pressures and priorities. Military aviation prioritized mission completion within acceptable risk parameters, often under circumstances where equipment loss was preferable to mission failure. Civilian aviation prioritized safety and efficiency within economic constraints, where any accident represented both human tragedy and financial liability that could destroy companies and careers. Maya's first major project had involved analyzing a series of incidents involving military pilots transitioning to civilian aviation careers. The study revealed patterns that both communities had suspected but never systematically documented. Transitioning pilots often struggled with civilian aviation's emphasis on standard procedures over adaptive decision-making, while civilian operators struggled to provide training that recognized military pilots' advanced skills while addressing gaps in civilian regulatory knowledge. The research had led to recommendations that were being implemented by major airlines and pilot training organizations. Military to civilian transition programs now included modules specifically designed to help military pilots understand civilian aviation culture and regulatory frameworks. Civilian training organizations had developed accelerated programs that recognized military pilots' advanced skills while ensuring compliance with civilian certification requirements. But the work that Maya found most meaningful involved supporting individual pilots facing career transitions similar to her own. Aviation Safety Solutions had developed a consulting practice specifically focused on helping military pilots navigate medical retirements, career changes, and the complex process of translating specialized military experience into civilian aviation opportunities. The cases varied widely in their specifics, but shared common themes. There was Rodriguez, a former Air Force pilot who developed hearing loss from years of high-noise flight operations and needed help identifying civilian aviation roles that didn't require Class 1 medical certification. There was Thompson, a Navy pilot who'd been grounded after a family tragedy and wanted to rebuild her career around aviation safety research rather than operational flying. There was Martinez, an Army helicopter pilot whose combat injuries had ended his military career, but who possessed expertise in emergency procedures that could benefit civilian emergency medical services. Each case required careful analysis of individual capabilities, institutional barriers, and available opportunities. Maya found herself serving as translator between military and civilian cultures, helping clients understand how their specialized knowledge could address civilian aviation challenges, while helping employers understand the value of military aviation experience in non-flying roles. The work drew on everything Maya had learned during her own transition. Her coffee shop experience had taught her patience with processes that seemed inefficient compared to military standards. Her museum volunteer work had developed her ability to communicate technical concepts to civilian audiences. Her forced anonymity had given her perspective on the psychological challenges of rebuilding professional identity around new roles and relationships. Most importantly, her own struggle with medical retirement had taught her to distinguish between temporary setbacks and permanent limitations, between individual failure and institutional challenges, between what could be changed and what needed to be accepted. These distinctions were crucial for pilots facing their own career transitions, many of whom were struggling with the same feelings of loss and displacement that had driven Maya to seek anonymity in civilian work. The Aviation Safety Solutions Office had become an informal gathering place for former military pilots working in various aspects of civilian aviation. Friday afternoon conversations often included controllers who'd transitioned from military to civilian air traffic control, mechanics
Who'd moved from military aircraft maintenance to civilian aviation, and engineers who'd applied military aviation experience to civilian aircraft design and safety improvements. These conversations revealed the extent to which military aviation expertise was distributed throughout civilian aviation, but rarely acknowledged or systematically utilized. Individual transitions succeeded or failed based largely on personal networks and chance encounters, rather than systematic institutional support. Maya began to see her own case, the accidental meeting with Captain Mitchell at Groundwork Coffee, as part of a larger pattern where valuable expertise was often lost simply because the right connections weren't made at the right times. This realization led to Maya's most ambitious project, developing a formal network that connected military pilots facing career transitions with civilian aviation organizations that could benefit from their expertise. The Military Civilian Aviation Bridge Program, launched in partnership with the Veterans Aviation Foundation and several major airlines, created systematic pathways for military pilots to transition into civilian aviation roles that utilized their specialized knowledge and experience. The program addressed gaps that had existed for decades. Military pilots facing medical retirement could now access career counseling that went beyond basic resume writing, to include detailed analysis of how their specific experience translated into civilian opportunities. Civilian aviation organizations could access a database of transitioning military pilots whose expertise matched their specific needs. Training programs were developed that prepared both sides for successful integration. Maya's role in the program combined elements of her military career, technical analysis, strategic planning, mission-focused problem-solving, with skills she'd developed during civilian transition. She found herself conducting interviews that required both professional assessment and personal empathy, writing reports that translated between military and civilian languages, and facilitating meetings that brought together people from cultures that shared aviation expertise but operated under very different assumptions about hierarchy, decision-making, and risk management. The most rewarding cases were ones where the match between military experience and civilian need created opportunities that benefited everyone involved. An airline that had been struggling with emergency procedures training hired a former military pilot whose combat experience included multiple engine failures under hostile conditions. A general aviation company developing new safety equipment recruited a former test pilot whose experience with experimental aircraft accelerated their certification process.
A flight training organization brought in former military instructors whose teaching methods dramatically improved their student completion rates. But Maya also encountered cases that reminded her of the institutional challenges that made these transitions difficult. There was the former fighter pilot whose security clearance restrictions limited her ability to discuss the specific experience that made her valuable to aerospace companies. There was the helicopter pilot whose combat injuries were visible enough to trigger disability discrimination despite his technical competence. There was the transport pilot whose PTSD symptoms were well managed but still carried stigma that complicated employment negotiations. These cases required advocacy that went beyond career counseling into systemic challenges involving security policy, disability rights, and mental health stigma. Maya found herself working with legal advocates, medical professionals, and policy researchers to address barriers that affected not just individual pilots, but entire communities of military veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The work was more complex and demanding than flying had ever been, but it was also more sustainable. Instead of depending on her personal physical capability, it drew on knowledge and experience that would actually improve with time and additional education. Instead of requiring her to compete with younger pilots for limited flying positions, it positioned her as an expert whose value increased as military and civilian aviation continued to evolve. 2 years after leaving Groundwork Coffee, Maya received an invitation that connected her current work to her original military service. The Naval War College wanted her to speak to a class of senior officers about institutional support for military personnel facing career transitions due to medical or family circumstances. The invitation acknowledged her expertise while recognizing her continued connection to military culture and values. Preparing for the presentation forced Maya to articulate what she'd learned during her transition from military service to civilian life, and then to aviation consulting. The central insight was that career transitions were institutional challenges as much as individual ones.
Military organizations were excellent at developing highly specialized expertise, but often provided inadequate support for personnel who needed to apply that expertise in civilian contexts. Civilian organizations needed military expertise, but often lacked understanding of how to integrate military personnel into civilian workplace cultures. The solution wasn't just better individual preparation for career transitions, though that was important, but systematic institutional changes that recognized the value of military expertise and created pathways for its continued utilization, even when service members could no longer perform their original military roles. Maya's presentation to the War College included case studies from her consulting work, analysis of successful transition programs, and recommendations for policy changes that would better support military personnel facing career transitions. But it also included her personal story, the 3 years of civilian anonymity, the accidental reconnection to aviation through Sarah Walsh's hearing, and the gradual process of rebuilding professional identity around consulting rather than flying. The personal elements weren't just narrative decoration, they were essential to understanding why institutional changes were necessary. Individual military personnel facing career transitions needed to see examples of successful adaptation, needed to understand that limitation in one area didn't preclude contribution in others, needed to know that their expertise remained valuable even when their original military roles were no longer available. The response from the War College audience was immediate and practical. Several officers approached Maya after her presentation with questions about specific cases, subordinates facing medical retirement, colleagues struggling with civilian job searches, family members dealing with transition challenges that went beyond basic employment placement. More significantly, the War College invited Maya to develop a curriculum module about career transition support that would be incorporated into senior leadership training. The module would teach military leaders how to better support personnel facing transitions, how to maintain connections with former service members whose expertise could benefit current operations,
and how to work with civilian organizations that could provide appropriate opportunities for transitioning military personnel. The curriculum development work brought Maya full circle to her original military role, but in a completely different context. Instead of planning flight operations, she was planning educational programs. Instead of training pilots to handle aircraft emergencies, she was training leaders to handle personnel transitions. Instead of ensuring mission success through technical competence, she was ensuring mission success through institutional learning and adaptation. The work required many of the same skills that had made her successful as a military pilot: attention to detail, systematic analysis, ability to perform under pressure, commitment to mission accomplishment, but applied them to challenges that were more complex and longer term than any single flight operation. Career transitions involved multiple organizations, various regulatory frameworks, diverse individual circumstances, and outcomes that might not be apparent for years after initial decisions were made. As Maya's reputation in the field grew, she began receiving invitations to speak at conferences, serve on advisory boards, and consult on research projects that addressed broader questions about military-civilian integration. The work took her to places and brought her into contact with people that would have been impossible to reach from a coffee shop in Seattle. But it also drew on insights she'd gained during her civilian anonymity. Understanding both military and civilian cultures from the inside had given Maya a perspective that purely military or purely civilian experts often lacked. She could translate between languages and assumptions that seemed obvious to insiders but were often incomprehensible across cultural boundaries. She could identify barriers that seemed natural to one community but were actually artificial constraints that could be addressed through policy changes or institutional reforms. Most importantly, she could speak from personal experience about the psychological challenges of career transition in ways that were credible to both military personnel facing those challenges and civilian leaders trying to understand how to support them. Her own struggle with medical retirement following the Haptic case fire, retirement, civilian employment, and professional identity reconstruction gave weight to her recommendations that purely academic analysis couldn't provide. 3 years after beginning her transition to aviation consulting, Maya found herself back at Groundwork Coffee, this time as a customer rather than an employee. Jessica was still working behind the counter, though she'd been promoted to manager and was training new employees with the same enthusiasm she'd once brought to teaching Maya about civilian customer service. "Look who's back," Jessica called out when she saw Maya enter. "How's the consulting business?" "Busier than I expected," Maya replied, ordering the same triple-shot Americano she'd made thousands of times for the anxious graduate student who'd been one of her regular customers. "Turns out there's a lot of demand for people who can translate between military and civilian aviation." They talked for a few minutes about the changes at the coffee shop, new equipment, different regular customers, expansion plans that would add a second location, and about Maya's work with aviation safety solutions. The conversation felt comfortable and natural, but also marked by awareness of how much had changed since Maya had worked there. "Do you miss it?" Jessica asked. "The simplicity of coffee shop work?" Maya considered the question seriously. Coffee shop work had provided structure and purpose during a period when her identity was too fragmented to support more demanding challenges. It had taught her skills and perspectives that proved valuable in her consulting career. It had been honest work that served a real need, even if it didn't fully utilize her education and experience. "I miss the clarity," Maya said finally. "When someone orders a latte, you make a latte. When the espresso machine needs cleaning, you clean it. The feedback is immediate and the standards are straightforward." She smiled. "Consulting involves a lot more ambiguity and long-term uncertainty." "But it's more meaningful?" Jessica suggested. "It's more connected to my training and experience," Maya replied. "Whether that makes it more meaningful depends on how you define meaning." The conversation reminded Maya of how much her understanding of meaningful work had evolved during her transition from military service to civilian life to aviation consulting. Military flying had provided purpose through connection to larger missions that extended beyond individual satisfaction. Coffee shop work had provided purpose through immediate service to people with straightforward needs. Aviation consulting provided purpose through application of specialized expertise to challenges that could improve safety and support individual careers. Each type of work had been meaningful in its own context, but aviation consulting felt most sustainable because it built on everything she'd learned rather than requiring her to set aside major portions of her experience and knowledge. It acknowledged her limitation. She couldn't fly aircraft anymore, while utilizing her capabilities in ways that continued to grow and develop. As Maya left the coffee shop and walked back to her car, she noticed aircraft approaching Seattle-Tacoma International Airport with the automatic attention of someone whose professional life remained connected to aviation. The sight no longer triggered the sharp sense of loss that had characterized her early civilian years. Instead, it reminded her of the community of expertise she remained part of, the ongoing mission of aviation safety and improvement she continued to serve, and the various ways individuals could contribute to that mission, regardless of their specific role or current capabilities. Her phone buzzed with a message from Captain Mitchell about a new case, a former Marine pilot facing medical retirement who needed help navigating the transition to civilian aviation consulting. She smiled as she read the details, already beginning to analyze how the pilot's experience might translate into civilian opportunities and what barriers might need to be addressed during the transition process. It was the kind of problem-solving that had always energized her, whether she was planning flight operations, perfecting espresso extraction, or developing career transition programs. The specific challenges changed, but the underlying satisfaction of applying expertise to complex problems remained constant.
For the first time since her medical retirement, Maya felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing work that utilized her full range of capabilities while serving purposes that extended beyond her individual circumstances. It had taken 5 years of civilian life to reach this point, but the journey had been necessary for understanding what came next. As she drove back to Aviation Safety Solutions, Maya was already thinking about the next client, the next project, the next opportunity to help someone else navigate the complex transition from military service to civilian contribution. It wasn't the career she'd planned when she first strapped into an F-18, but it was a career that honored both her limitations and her capabilities, that built on her experience while serving a mission that mattered. The sky above Seattle was clear enough to see stars beginning to appear as evening approached, and Maya found herself unconsciously tracking aircraft lights as they moved through the darkness. Somewhere up there, pilots were conducting the same kind of careful navigation she'd once practiced, making the same kinds of calculated decisions about risk and safety that defined aviation at every level. She couldn't join them in the cockpit anymore, but she was supporting them from the ground in ways that mattered just as much. And for Maya Chen, former lieutenant commander, former coffee shop employee, current aviation safety consultant, that was enough. 5 years later. The lecture hall at the U.S. Naval Academy was packed with midshipmen whose enthusiasm for aviation careers reminded Maya of her own younger self, back when the sky had seemed like an infinite frontier waiting to be conquered through technical competence and sheer determination. Standing at the podium where she'd once sat as a student, Maya felt the weight of experience that came with understanding both the possibilities and limitations that defined military aviation careers. "How many of you plan to become pilots?" she asked, watching dozens of hands shoot up with the kind of confidence that came from not yet knowing how many variables could influence that outcome. Medical conditions, family circumstances, service needs, technological changes, all factors that seemed abstract and manageable until they became personal and immediate. "Good," Maya continued, "but I want to talk to you today about something equally important. What happens when you can't fly anymore? Not if, when. Because every pilot's flying career ends eventually,
whether through medical retirement, family obligations, normal aging, or simple career progression to positions that require different skills. The midshipmen shifted slightly in their seats, the kind of uncomfortable movement that suggested she was addressing topics they'd prefer not to consider. Maya understood the reaction. She had felt the same way during her own academy years, when any discussion of limitation or career transition had seemed like acknowledging defeat before the battle had even begun. I'm not here to discourage you from pursuing aviation careers. I'm here to help you understand that aviation is bigger than any individual's ability to fly aircraft, and that the expertise you'll develop as pilots has value that extends far beyond your time in the cockpit. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing statistics about military pilot retention, career transitions, and the various paths that aviation careers could take. The numbers told a story that was both sobering and hopeful. While flying careers were necessarily limited by physical and institutional factors, aviation expertise could be applied to challenges that lasted entire lifetimes.
Each of these people faced career transitions that initially seemed like endings, Maya explained. Medical conditions, family circumstances, service requirements, situations that forced them to find new ways to contribute to aviation without continuing to fly. But their stories aren't tragedies. They're examples of how expertise can evolve and adapt to serve different but equally important purposes. During the question and answer session that followed, the midshipmen's questions revealed both their ambitions and their anxieties about military aviation careers. They wanted to know about the latest aircraft technologies, about combat operations, about the path to Top Gun training and other elite programs. But they also asked about work-life balance, about family considerations, about the long-term prospects for military aviation in an era of increasing automation and changing strategic priorities. Maya answered all the questions honestly, drawing on her own experience and the cases she'd encountered through her consulting work. Military aviation offered opportunities for professional development and public service that were difficult to find in civilian careers, but it also demanded sacrifices and carried risks that needed to be understood and accepted. The key was approaching aviation careers with both ambition and realism, with commitment to excellence and acceptance of limitation. After the presentation, Maya was approached by several midshipmen who wanted more detailed information about career paths that combined aviation expertise with other professional interests. There was a young woman interested in aerospace engineering who wanted to understand how military pilot experience could enhance design and safety work. There was a man considering medical school who was curious about aviation medicine and the challenges of keeping pilots healthy and operational. There was another woman exploring law school who was interested in aviation regulation and policy development. These conversations reminded Maya of her own evolution from single-minded focus on flying to broader understanding of aviation as a complex field that offered multiple ways to contribute. The midshipmen were already thinking beyond their initial career goals to consider how their interests and aptitudes might develop over time. They were approaching military service with the kind of strategic thinking that would serve them well regardless of how their specific careers evolved. 10 years later, Maya's office at the Federal Aviation Administration overlooked the Potomac River, its windows providing a view that included both civilian aircraft approaching Ronald Reagan Airport and military helicopters conducting operations around the nation's capital. The dual perspective was appropriate for her current role as Deputy Director of Aviation Safety Research, a position that required constant translation between military and civilian aviation cultures. The FAA job had been a natural progression from her consulting work, offering the opportunity to influence aviation safety policy at the national level while continuing to support individual pilots facing career transitions. Maya's military background and civilian consulting experience made her uniquely qualified to address safety challenges that affected both communities,
and her personal experience with medical retirement provided credibility with pilots facing similar circumstances. The morning briefing covered a range of issues that would have been incomprehensible to her younger self, but now felt like natural extensions of the problem-solving skills she'd developed throughout her aviation career. There was a study of pilot fatigue factors that drew on both military operational tempo research and civilian scheduling regulations. There was a review of training standards that incorporated lessons learned from military aviation accidents into civilian pilot certification requirements. There was an analysis of new aircraft technologies that required updating safety protocols for both military and civilian operations. But the case that commanded most of Maya's attention involved a series of incidents where civilian pilots with military backgrounds had made decisions that were appropriate for military operations but violated civilian aviation regulations. The pattern suggested gaps in transition training that could be addressed through policy changes and educational programs. Maya's analysis of the incidents revealed a familiar dynamic. Military pilots were trained to accept higher levels of risk in exchange for mission completion, while civilian aviation prioritized safety margins that sometimes conflicted with military decision-making habits. The solution wasn't to change either culture, but to provide better preparation for pilots transitioning between them.
The resulting policy recommendations became the foundation for new FAA regulations that required enhanced training for military pilots seeking civilian aviation careers. The training addressed not just technical differences between military and civilian aircraft, but cultural differences in risk assessment, decision-making authority, and regulatory compliance. The programs were developed in partnership with military aviation commands and civilian training organizations, creating systematic support for transitions that had previously been managed on an ad hoc basis. The work was satisfying in ways that connected to everything Maya had learned during her own career transition. Instead of helping individual pilots navigate career changes, she was now developing systematic solutions that would benefit thousands of pilots facing similar challenges. Instead of consulting on specific cases, she was influencing policy that would shape aviation safety for decades to come. During lunch breaks, Maya often walked along the Potomac, watching aircraft operations that reminded her of the continued vitality of aviation as both a technical field and a professional community. The sight of military helicopters and civilian airliners sharing airspace illustrated the complexity of modern aviation and the need for expertise that could bridge different operational requirements and regulatory frameworks. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Walsh, now a captain commanding a fighter squadron and serving as an advocate for pilots facing review boards similar to the one that had once threatened her career. Sarah's message included a photo from a ceremony honoring the 10th anniversary of the review board reforms that had resulted from her case and Maya's testimony. The reforms had created systematic support for military pilots facing emergency situations, reducing the likelihood that competent pilots would be grounded for making reasonable decisions under pressure. The changes had been implemented gradually, with input from pilots, safety experts, and legal advocates who understood both the need for accountability and the importance of supporting good judgment under extreme circumstances. Maya's role in those reforms had been acknowledged in the official history of the changes, but she took more satisfaction from the individual pilots who had benefited from improved policies and procedures. Each successful case represented not just bureaucratic progress, but human lives and careers that had been protected by institutional learning and adaptation. 15 years later, the Museum of the Flight's new exhibit on military-civilian aviation cooperation featured Maya's story prominently, but as part of a larger narrative about the evolution of aviation safety and the ways different communities had learned to share expertise across institutional boundaries. Standing in front of the display with her teenage niece,
Maya felt both pride in her contribution and awareness of how much the field had continued to evolve since her own career transition. "So you really flew fighter jets off aircraft carriers?" her niece asked, examining a photograph of Maya in flight gear standing beside an F-18. The image was from her active duty years, when aviation had seemed like a permanent identity rather than one chapter in a longer professional story. "For 15 years, Maya replied, "and then I spent 3 years serving coffee, and then 20 years working on aviation safety from the ground. All of it was important, but in different ways." Her niece, who was considering applying to the Naval Academy herself, asked the kinds of questions that revealed both genuine interest and realistic understanding of military service commitments. She wanted to know about the challenges Maya had faced as a woman in military aviation, about the balance between personal and professional obligations, about the ways military service had prepared her for civilian leadership roles. Maya answered honestly, describing both the opportunities and limitations she had encountered, the satisfactions and frustrations that had characterized different phases of her career. Military aviation had provided unparalleled opportunities for technical challenge and public service, but it had also demanded sacrifices that not everyone was prepared to make. Civilian consulting had offered more flexibility and longer-term career sustainability, but it had required rebuilding professional identity around new types of contribution.
The important thing, Maya told her niece, is understanding that careers evolve. What you start doing isn't necessarily what you'll end up doing, and that's not failure, it's adaptation. The skills you develop in any challenging field can be applied to problems you haven't even imagined yet. The conversation continued as they walked through the rest of the museum, past exhibits that featured aircraft from every era of aviation history. Maya found herself pointing out connections between different periods and technologies, explaining how innovations in military aviation had influenced civilian aircraft development, and how safety lessons learned in one context had prevented accidents in others. Her niece was particularly interested in the exhibit about unmanned aircraft systems, which represented aviation technologies that hadn't existed during Maya's active flying years, but now dominated discussions about the future of both military and civilian aviation. The display included information about the new career paths these technologies were creating: remote pilots, system analysts, ethical oversight specialists, roles that required aviation expertise but didn't depend on traditional pilot skills. "Are you worried that automated systems will replace human pilots?" her niece asked. Maya considered the question carefully. Automation had already transformed aviation in ways that were both beneficial and challenging, eliminating some types of human error while creating new requirements for human oversight and intervention. The future would likely include more automation, but also more complex challenges that required human judgment and expertise. Every generation of aviators has faced technological changes that seemed threatening but turned out to create new opportunities, Maya said. The key is staying adaptable and finding ways to contribute that build on your expertise while addressing new challenges. As they left the museum, Maya's niece asked one final question. "Do you ever regret not being able to fly anymore?" Maya paused beside her car, looking up at aircraft approaching Seattle-Tacoma International Airport with the automatic attention that had never faded despite decades of ground-based work. The sight still triggered memories of her flying years, the weight of a helmet, the satisfaction of a perfect landing, the adrenaline of formation flight at high speed and low altitude. "I miss it," Maya said honestly. "Flying was extraordinary in ways that are difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced it. But I don't regret the path my career took after flying ended. The work I've done since then has been different but equally meaningful, and it's reached more people than I could have influenced from a cockpit." She smiled at her niece, remembering her own younger self's certainty that aviation meant only one thing: being the person in control of the aircraft. The sky is bigger than any individual pilot's ability to reach it. There are lots of ways to contribute to aviation, and all of them matter. 20 years later, Maya's retirement celebration at the FAA was attended by representatives from across the aviation community.
military pilots she'd helped transition to civilian careers, civilian safety specialists whose work had been influenced by her research, government officials whose policies had been shaped by her recommendations, and industry leaders whose organizations had implemented programs she'd developed. The event felt like a reunion of communities that had been brought together through shared commitment to aviation safety and professional development. Former military pilots who now worked for airlines sat beside civilian aviation researchers who had collaborated on military safety studies. Government officials who had implemented policy reforms shared stories with industry representatives who had adapted their organizations to support military-civilian career transitions. Captain Sarah Walsh, now Admiral Walsh and Commander of Naval Air Forces, delivered the keynote address that traced the evolution of military aviation policies from the early days of limited institutional support for career transitions to the current comprehensive programs that recognize the value of aviation expertise across multiple career phases. Maya Chen's story illustrates something essential about military service and professional development. Excellence isn't just about individual achievement, it's about contributing to institutional learning that benefits everyone who comes after you. Maya's transition from active-duty pilot to aviation safety expert created pathways that thousands of other pilots have followed to meaningful civilian careers.
The address included statistics about the programs Maya had helped develop. Military-civilian transition support that had achieved 95% successful placement rates for pilots facing career changes. Safety research that had contributed to a 40% reduction in aviation accidents over 2 decades. Policy reforms that had improved institutional support for military personnel facing medical or family-related career transitions. But Maya found the most meaningful moments in the informal conversations that took place throughout the evening. Individual pilots approached her with stories about how her work had influenced their careers, how the programs she'd developed had helped them navigate challenges similar to those she'd faced during her own transition from military service. There was Martinez, now a senior executive at an aerospace company, who credited Maya's transition consulting with helping him find a career path that utilized his combat aviation experience in civilian aircraft design. There was Thompson, now a professor at a major university, whose research on aviation safety had been inspired by Maya's analysis of military-civilian cultural differences. There was Rodriguez, now running his own aviation consulting firm, who had learned from Maya's example that expertise could be shared across institutional boundaries. These conversations reminded Maya of the ripple effects that individual career transitions could create when they were supported by institutional understanding and systematic programming. Her own struggle with medical retirement and civilian career development had led to work that influenced thousands of other professionals facing similar challenges. As the evening concluded, Maya found herself standing outside the FAA building, looking up at aircraft lights moving across the Washington sky. The sight had become a daily routine during her 20 years of government service, a reminder of the continued vitality of aviation and the ongoing need for safety research and policy development. Her phone buzzed with a message from her niece, now Lieutenant Sarah Chen, recently graduated from the Naval Academy and beginning flight training at Pensacola. The message included a photo from her first solo flight, along with a note thanking Maya for encouraging her to pursue aviation while also understanding it as one chapter in a longer professional story. Maya smiled as she read the message, remembering her own first solo flight decades earlier and the sense of unlimited possibility that had characterized her early aviation career. Her niece would face different challenges and opportunities, would develop expertise in aircraft systems and operational environments that hadn't existed during Maya's active flying years. But the fundamental satisfaction of aviation, the technical challenge, the teamwork, the contribution to missions that mattered, would be the same. And when her niece eventually faced her own career transitions, whether due to medical issues, family circumstances, or changing service requirements, she would have examples and support systems that had been developed through the experiences of previous generations of aviators. That continuity, Maya realized, was what made individual career transitions meaningful beyond their personal impact.
Each successful adaptation to changing circumstances created knowledge and resources that could benefit others facing similar challenges. Each innovative solution to professional obstacles became part of institutional learning that strengthened the entire aviation community. As Maya walked to her car for the last time as an FAA employee, her body still responding to decades of military and civilian scheduling that had shaped her daily routines. But instead of preparing for another day of policy analysis and program management, she found herself planning for retirement activities that would keep her connected to aviation while exploring interests she'd never had time to pursue during her working years. There would be volunteer work at the Museum of Flight, where she could continue sharing aviation history with young people considering their own career paths. There would be
occasional consulting projects that drew on her expertise without requiring full-time commitment. There would be writing projects that captured lessons learned during her transition from military to civilian aviation work. Most importantly, there would be time to watch the continuing evolution of aviation from the perspective of someone who had contributed to that evolution, while understanding it as part of a story much larger than any individual career. The sky would continue to draw young people toward challenges and opportunities that couldn't be fully imagined in advance. Aviation would continue to evolve in ways that created new requirements for expertise and institutional learning. And somewhere, other pilots would face career transitions that seemed like endings but would turn out to be new beginnings. Other professionals would discover that their specialized knowledge could be applied to problems they hadn't anticipated. Other individuals would learn that adaptation and service could take forms they had never considered when they first chose their career paths. Maya Chen had learned to fly fighter jets, to serve coffee with professional pride, to consult on aviation safety, and to influence national policy. Each phase of her career had required different skills and offered different satisfactions, but all had been connected by commitment to excellence and service that extended beyond individual achievement. As she sat at her kitchen table with her morning coffee, looking at the single photograph that still occupied her wall, that sunset over the Pacific, no longer cropped to hide her military service, but displayed with pride in the mission it represented, Maya felt ready for whatever came next. The sky was still calling, just in different voices than the one she'd heard as a young pilot. And Maya Chen, former lieutenant commander, former coffee shop employee, former aviation safety consultant, and former government executive, was ready to listen. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.